what I'm going to talk about now is writing cartridges. We probably see, I'm real curious to see what the percentages actually come out to be, but how are community contributions going to show up in Origin? What are people really interested in going to contribute, extending Origin? So cartridges are probably going to be the vast majority of things that are contributed back. You know, the OpenShift core, the brokers, the nodes, all that stuff around it, that core stuff is probably not where the majority of people are going to go and extend OpenShift. Right? They're going to say, hey, it's great that you have Python. It's great that you have JBoss, whatever. But what I want is actually maybe a customized version of what you have, or a whole different kind of stack that you want to go and set up. You know, from the JE world, you know, you can talk a couple of different application servers that we run into all the time. You know, I hate to mention our competition, but hey, I want a WebSphere cartridge. I want a WebLogic cartridge. I want a Glassfish cartridge. Red Hat's obviously not going to go write those, but there's no reason why somebody out there in the community couldn't go write one of these kind of cartridges, and then I can go and click, and I've actually spun up Glassfish. Right? And then you've got there's just a different JE stack. So that's probably where the majority of contributions are probably going to come from. We don't know yet. We're still relatively young. And then probably the second one is probably in plugins, right? Of customizing the authentication authorization piece, or customizing DNS, or some of those other plugins to the broker. And then probably the third one will actually be kind of core parts of the broker, or core parts of the actual node around collective and some of that other stuff. So what I'm going to focus on this next one, and the timing is really perfect, and that's why we're doing this presentation now, is because the Cartridge V2 specification is just about to come out. There's a lot of reasons why this is the time to talk about. This is now or very soon is the time to start. If you're interested in writing cartridges, it's the time to get involved, and you're really enabled to do that relatively easily. So really the kind of audience for you're a developer, you're interested in going and creating, hey, all these cartridges that JBoss, that OpenShift has got are great, but I want this other stack, or I want a customized stack. And you want to go and add different services. So again, here's my, that I have to show all the time, right? You guys all know these all by now, right? Okay. Before I kind of get into the new cartridge spec and maybe a little bit of history of why there is a new cartridge spec, let me just give you a couple of kind of suggestions when you start to go down this road. Number one, if you've got your stack, right, and you want to go and start to create a cartridge, historically the easiest way to go do this is go take my application or my stack and go deploy it in one of our DIY cartridges. DIY is essentially an empty gear. It goes and has all the security around it, it has all the resource stuff, it'll spin up all the stuff, there's no stack inside. So you can go put anything you want in here. And before we had a Tomcat cartridge, right? Their Tomcat is the biggest Java application server out there. People were going and just saying, hey, it's really easy for me to go and install Tomcat inside of a DIY and spin it up, and I've got Tomcat running. It's just that you've got to manually go configure this stuff. So one of the suggestions is, and becoming less so with V2, but it's still something to consider, go take your stack and try to get it into it, because you'll run into where does my application conflict with OpenShift. And this is music to my ears with Dan saying that this localhost problem is going to be solved, because it's going to solve lots of people's problems. Yours, mine, and everybody's. But you'll run into those problems immediately. Hey, I'm trying to bind to something that I can't bind to. And this is a real easy way to uncover those problems. The next thing to do is go take a look at, maybe there's a lot of Quickstarts out there, and I'll talk about those at the very end of the talk. But there are a lot of Quickstarts out there on GitHub that will let you go very quickly in a couple of little Git commands, go and install something on top of one of the out-of-the-box cartridges to spin up Django or something like that. So maybe there's actually a Quickstart out there that for your stack, there's already a Quickstart, there isn't a cartridge created, but this is also kind of another step. I don't want to write a whole cartridge. But maybe a Quickstart's the way to go. I just want to go create my little my stack inside of a GitHub project, and maybe that's a good step. Again, because V2 is coming around, it's a lot easier to build cartridges. This may fade as well, or at least be easier maybe to go. The other thing is that there's a lot of patterns already in the cartridges that are out there. It's all open source. If you say, hey, I want to create a Glassfish cartridge, a good place to start is probably copy the JBoss cartridge, because they're probably going to have a lot of the same problems, right? They're going to have to deal with clustering, and inter-gear communication about state replication or whatever your particular problem is. Or I'm going to go try to create an embeddable database cartridge. I want to go add, pick your database of choice. Well, we've got 3 examples out there. Start there. That's probably a good place. Copy it, and maybe there's only a couple of different things you've got to do, and you can have a cartridge really simple. Okay, so I'll actually get back to that slide in a second. But let me talk a little bit about the history. Yeah.
And these cartridges they're universal between like enterprise, online, or origin. Once you write a cartridge, you don't have to modify it for review.
Let me answer that question by giving some history.
Okay.
Because that's actually one of the problems of the version 1, which is kind of what we're running today in online and what's available today in Origin. There's a couple of problems. It was all open source before Summit, May of this time last year. It was all open source, it's all out there, but there are some kind of weaknesses of the original card spec. It was fine for us for online when it was all of us internally, we were just providing these services, but it really became unwieldy, and it's certainly kind of too unwieldy for the community to go and embrace and easily create cartridges. And a couple of reasons why. Lots and lots of files you had to go and create. When you see the V2, it's a lot simpler. There was years after cartridges are instantiated on nodes, and there was a blurring of whose responsibility to do what when a cartridge gets instantiated. Is it the node's responsibility to go and do this, or is it the cartridge's responsibility to do this? And there was a real kind of blurring there, so it was kind of unclear about where the boundaries between the node and the cartridge were. Kind of an example is cartridges needed root access to do things, and that's not the case in V2, right? The cartridge developer shouldn't have to need root access to do anything. The other big thing was the cartridges themselves couldn't support multiple versions of that particular stack. I could not support Python 2.6, 2.7, and 3.3 in one cartridge. You had to write 3 cartridges. That's a pain in the ass. The other thing is, and this gets back to the question, the API between the node and the cartridge is not versioned. Worked fine for us in online because we had one release every 3 weeks, and as long as it rolled into production and everything worked fine, who cares, right? It was great. Didn't matter that it was version because there was nobody running it locally. So the problem is that you have cartridges now, because they weren't versioned. If you have a particular version of Origin, it may or may not work with the version of the cartridge you've got, because there isn't a version that these are talking to a particular API. So obviously this is a huge problem. Shows kind of a little bit of the history about where we came from in the online world. Card V2 fixes a lot of these problems, and I cannot tell you how much easier it is to go run a cartridge. Well, I will, actually, at the very end of this. So I'm going to show you the Tomcat cartridge that I wrote on, what day is it? Sunday? I wrote on Friday morning. It took about an hour. It's very easy. So it really, really dramatically, an order of magnitude or more, the number of kind of files that you've got to write, the number of scripts you've got to write, all that stuff is really, really, really reduced. There's no very clear boundary between what the node does and what the cartridge does. Cartridges don't need and don't get root access. There's a well-defined and maybe more importantly a versioned API, so that if you have a version of a cartridge that talks to 1.0, 2.0, whatever of the API, of the node API, then that cartridge can be installed on that node. Multiple versions support in a cartridge. You write a cartridge, you write your Python 2, you write your Python cartridge, and maybe the first thing you start with is Python 2.6. And you go, hey, I want to support 2.7. Then you do and say, hey, you know what, I just want to do the deltas. What's different in my cartridge between 2.6 and 2.7? You don't have to write the 90% of the stuff that you've got in the cartridge for each version. You just do the deltas between the particular versions on the cartridge. All the doc is here. This is still work in progress. We are lights at the end of the tunnel kind of point right now, but we're not done. It's at the point where if you want to go start writing cartridges, I encourage you to do so. There's no reason to hold off. People are holding off for the V2 work. We're at the stage right now where enough of this is stable, well documented. There's still a couple of pieces that we're still working on, but there's no reason to kind of hold off and wait. This will all be completed over the next kind of couple of weeks. And it'll certainly, all these cartridges are being converted right now. We're internally converting all the V1 cartridges to V2 cartridges, and we're going to flip the switch probably pretty soon, and certainly before summer. Yes.
And the V2 stuff can be run from the nightly builds, yes?
I'm going to show that on Christmas Cool Bakers thing at the very end. I'm actually going to go install the V2 cartridge when I wrote on Friday, spin it up, and it's all just running on. So what do I need to do to write a cartridge? Very, very little at this point, as far as kind of a minimum with V2. So this is kind of the directory structure, and these are the files that you've got to write, and what kind of API, what do I have to implement. The main thing is really two scripts. There's a setup script, which is when you go and instantiate one of your cartridges, you spin up an application, the node is going to go do all that cool stuff. It's going to create the user, create the directory, populate the directory with the cartridge, essentially take all the files that are in the cartridge and plop them down into that user space. And then it's going to call setup. And setup is essentially, I need to go, the cartridge will say, I'm going to go take these files, and what do I need to do to go and spin all this stuff up? This used to be huge in old V1, and now it's actually pretty simple. Hey, I want to create a link. Maybe I want to go and actually say, hey, my JBoss home is actually an FC alternative somewhere for this particular version. I want to create links, or I want to copy some stuff around. Really kind of what happens when I actually just want to go configure it. And then control is really where the API is. It's going to say, hey, what do I do when somebody says start this application, or stop this application, or reload this application, and stuff like that. And I'll talk about that API in a minute. ENV is where you can create application-specific environmental variables using ERVs. So it's all kind of Ruby-based. And the metadata, the manifest, one of the really nice things is a lot of this stuff is all metadata-based right now. So you define a ton of stuff in the manifest. If you've watched Origin over the last year, there's been more and more stuff that we're now taking out of that you have to write a script for, that there's just a cool YAML file that you can go and create the metadata, and the node will do all the magic for you, so that you have to do all these scripts. So inside of, I can go create, again, this is kind of a minimum, what do I have to go and put in there? You've got to give your cartridge a name, there's a short name in there, what version is it, what cartridge version is it, and different endpoints, and endpoints I'll talk about in a bit, are really hot. You know, what do I want to expose? What do I want to expose externally? What kind of ports, protocols do I want to expose to other gears? And here's that point. So, and this is really kind of one of the I don't want to say trickier, but this is one of the kind of more complex pieces of some of the more complex cartridges. If you've got a simple kind of web cartridge, then all I'm going to do is all I want to really do is go advertise externally HTTP. To come back to the menu example right there, I'm just going to have a simple web app that's going to go, and there's not going to be any inter-tier communication. I don't need to talk to a database, or I don't want a database to talk to me. These are the kind of things that you go in and advertise inside. So when you go and define an endpoint out there, you say, hey, I want to go and define this private IP name. And I just call it kind of IP, and what's going to turn out is, what the node's going to do when you define all this stuff is it's going to go create all these environmental variables that your application can then go use. So the short name is defined, is the cartridge short name, so call it JBoss AS. And then, so when you go say, hey, I'm going to have a variable that's really going to be your HTTP port, that's going to say, it's going to come back to your environmental variable, it's going to go OpenShift JBoss AS IP. And this is going to be the IP, that 127 that you can bind to, that unique loopback that you can bind to. And you say, hey, so I need an IP address. This is actually coming back from the node that'll be defined. And then there's some other kind of proxy areas that you can say, not only am I going to go and advertise HTTP over this particular port, but I also want to go and advertise some other things that I want to maybe go talk to other gears to. Like if you're a database, you're going to say, hey, I want to advertise what's the MySQL port of whatever it is. I want to actually broadcast this. I'm not talking about HTTP. I want to broadcast. I want to make sure that the other gears or other cartridge installations can go and see a particular, this port. This is how you go and define it, and it's going to go create the environmental variables for it too. So there's an advertising piece, and there's a piece from how the node is going to come back and tell you what's available to you. So this is where you're really defining the endpoints of the particular application. Any questions there? Hooks, there's a pub sub mechanism inside of cartridges, right? So if you have a JBoss cartridge and you've got a MySQL cartridge instantiated in your application. These are running on potentially two different gears, and they need to talk to each other, right, to get all this automatic configuration going. We've got a pub sub mechanism that's built in as part of our OpenShift, and this is how you actually configure the pub sub mechanism. So if you're saying, I'm MySQL, I need to advertise what my port is that I'm listening on, what the IP address or what the URL is that you want to actually go bind, that people need to come and hit to talk to me, what the username is, what the password is. I need to go and send this over to my JBoss application so it can automatically configure itself to come talk to me. So this is the mechanism that's used where there's everything inside of your application, no matter how many gears it is going to publish whatever you specify inside of this publishers area. Whether it's whatever kind of protocol, this is how the kind of stuff that you're going to go advertise, whatever kind of information you want to go and publish to any other nodes that are listening. And this is saying, hey, this particular cartridge is listening for this information. So in the MySQL case, the example is MySQL is going to go and broadcast, here is the MySQL host, here is the MySQL port. And anybody who's interested in MySQL, who wants to talk to MySQL, is going to subscribe to that particular channel so that when that MySQL comes up, they get a message, they get notified and go, hey, MySQL just came up, I need to do something with this information. So you sent two different scripts that says, hey, I want to publish my MySQL information. The scripts are really small, I can show it to you. It's just going to go and do an echo and say, here's my host, here's my port. And then anybody who's subscribing to this inside of the application is going to say, hey, when somebody sends me a host and a port on this MySQL channel, I'm going to know to go and configure a data source for MySQL. So all this stuff is contained inside of the cartridges, but the pub sub mechanism is handled really by OpenShift. Questions there? This is kind of the trickier part. If you just kind of am going to go create a fairly simple web application and you don't need a lot of inter-gear communication, it's really simple. You don't really have to worry too much about this at all. Like you really need to just going to go and say, hey, I'm advertising, my endpoint is HTTP, I'm happy with that. Maybe I want to have a database, so I should listen to MySQL information if somebody has MySQL database. But some of the stuff when you get into like JBoss and real clustering, where you're going to have clustered messaging, then these guys need to know I've got now a 4-node cluster and everybody needs to know about all the other nodes. So there can be more kind of complicated depending on what kind of cartridge you're writing. Yeah?
So is this global? Is it like everybody on the node, or is it just restricted to
everybody inside of the application.
Okay.
So the pub sub mechanism, every channel is local to the application. And this kind of gets back to the buddy thing. Right now it's all contained inside of the application, but we need to expand that to say, to allow the user to say, yeah, I've got these two applications, but I want them to be buddies so that they pub sub to each other outside of their application. We don't do that today, but that's how that's broken down. Yeah.
And is it cached, that information, so if you say I'm publishing this and the other guy is not ready to get it yet, is there any orchestration there that needs to be done?
It's not cached, but when it gets bounced, when either one of those instances gets started, it pub subs. You'll get a pub sub again. So if you bounce it, it'll come back. So if I have, I'll use JBoss as an example, right? If I've got a 1-node JBoss cluster and it needs to talk to this guy, I bring up another one. As soon as I bounce these two guys, they'll pub sub again, and they'll see, hey, there's another node right here. I need to go and cluster with this guy. So it's not. It happens at restart time, not at instantiation time. Any other questions?
Is there, so if you've got one cartridge, say your database cartridge that's been updated to V2 and you've got a V1
Yep.
cartridge, do they talk to each other? Is there, or do you need to?
Do a V1 and a V2 talk to each other?
Yeah, is the pub sub mechanism the same, or?
Currently, you can only have either your system configured for V1 or for V2. They won't both be available in the system.
Okay.
Well, and I can show that at the end. There's actually a little kind of command to toggle your OpenShift back and forth between V1 and V2. Hopefully V1 is going to be gone, put in the grave really pretty quickly. If you go back and if you start playing with V1, and then you play with V2, you'll never, ever, ever gonna wanna play with V1 again. So that's gonna die hopefully a pretty quick death. It was fine for us in online, and isn't for the community kind of at large. Setup again is really, really easy. The setup stuff is once the files are put into there, what do you need to tweak? You know, it's going to do a copy of all your files from the cartridge into that local space. What do you need to tweak? Do I need to create links, create jars, whatever you need to do, create maybe cartridge-defined environmental variables, pre-populate something in a data directory, whatever you want to do. So there's not a lot to do, but this is really this kind of setup stuff before the application actually comes up. And then this is the API for control, start, stop, build, and deploy. There's some other ones down here, but these are really the major ones. These are the life cycle of your application. Once it's actually gone and installed, once you've gone through the setup, what do I do when somebody calls start on this? You know, do I spin up Apache? Is that all I need to do? A lot of the cartridges are Apache-based, with something sitting deployed on top of Apache. And, you know, or do I start up JBoss? Do I spin up Tomcat? Whatever. Stopping the cartridge. So this is all very cartridge-specific stuff, right? What happens when somebody calls build? So when you've got your application, I showed earlier a Java application that's Maven-based. Well, all the cartridges have different build mechanisms inside of them. The Java ones, at least that we've got right now, are all based on Maven. So what the build thing is doing is actually goes and spins off, does a Maven build. It'll say, I'm a Java cartridge, I'm using Maven, so let me go spin up the Maven build. But all the different cartridges have different build mechanisms. Some of them actually, you know, there's no compilation for some of the different cartridges. So this will actually just run a test. It'll go through the source and make sure that the source is all valid for some of the non-compiled languages, some of the dynamic languages. Deploy is what happens. This is the kind of the step that happens after a build, but before you actually go and spin it up. So the life cycle really goes when you go do a git push. It's going to do a stop, a build, a deploy, and a start. So what do I actually do at the deploy stage? A lot of the kind of dynamic languages, there's really nothing in there because there's nothing that really got spit out here. I'm going to spin up Apache. It's all going to be run from the source. I'm not creating wars. So this is in a lot of cases really simple. Say in JBoss's case, it's a little more complicated because the build stage, I created the deployable archive, so I need to make sure at the deploy stage those deployable archives are going to the right place, the actual runtime deployments directory or Tomcat, the web apps directory. A couple of other ones here, but those are really the big ones. And so that, as far as writing scripts, is really it. There's a couple of other ones like teardown. I think that's maybe on the next slide. This is optional. If when somebody comes and says, hey, I want to get rid of this cartridge, what do I got to? Is there special stuff I've got to do to tear down this cartridge? This is optional. You don't necessarily have to do it because when somebody comes in and actually wipes out the whole application, the node is going to clean everything out anyway. But for this particular cartridge, is there stuff you need to clean up? Like you can have. I think a good example is if I've got a JBoss and I've got a database. And I've added the database, and then I'm going to say, hey, wait a minute, I want to keep JBoss, but I just want to get rid of this particular cartridge. Right? I want to get rid of this database because maybe I want to replace MySQL with Postgres. So I get rid of the MySQL database. Is there some cleanup I need to do when I just get rid of the MySQL? So there's an option to go and do a teardown. The next one is template, and this is kind of an interesting one. Because I'm really curious to see where it goes as we venture out of the kind of more web-facing applications. But this is as part of your cartridge. This is where you're going to go and define your default application. God, I hate using the word application so much. This is when I did the initial app and I went up and there's sort of like the hello world. It said welcome to OpenShift, and we changed it to welcome to OpenStack or deployed on OpenShift or whatever it was. So this is the kind of the templated application that when somebody goes and spins up an app and they go hit the URL for that app, this is what they'll see, right? And so this is the first thing that you're going to get rid of. But at least we want that when somebody goes and spins up a default cartridge, they have something deployed that when you go and just hit the root context of that URL, you're going to see something on the page, right? So this will all immediately be replaced as soon as you put your real application in there. But this is where you can go and define what that default's supposed to look like as soon as you instantiate that cartridge. Now, for a database, right, there isn't a default application for a database. So this is really only in the context of web applications, or maybe as we see some other things coming down the road, there could be some, you know, for, I don't know, data grid or something, you may have something you want to
Because
deploy.
if the database has a REST admin and, REST
Yeah.
admin interface.
That could be it, yeah.
Like
If there's something you wanted to deploy to this new instance. Yeah.
What if there were, this concept of templating, I understand like normally we would remove this for cartridges, it's more like a hello world for the app, right?
Yep.
But if there was a bit of code that needed to get generated, like let's say I had developer keys or something that I wanted to include, would this templating be possibly a way to splice together other keys or something, or is that best left out of this?
Every instance of the cartridge is going to get this, so this isn't going to be user specific.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Or you don't want key, but if, what I was thinking is if I could pass in on the, you know, give me a new cartridge and here's an extra option, pass this into the cartridge's template, right? So that when the cartridge starts up, it already has my application-specific keys included.
So I have a branch that I'm working on that will give you something similar to this, but it's after you spin up the application, you'll be able to set environment.
Okay, all right. So it's still handled a little bit different.
Yeah, it won't be this because that would happen after everything.
And it'd be through session variables, just like all the rest of the application-specific config details.
It would be like a REST API, so it would just create an environment variable on the
Okay, all right. Cool. Sorry, good to know. Thanks.
Couple of interesting things inside of the application, other than the actual kind of hello world itself. There's some other stuff that you can put in there that will give the user kind of future control. You remember that back in the demo there was that .OpenShift, the hidden folder that had kind of configuration information in it. That's where this stuff comes from. It comes from the kind of template app. You're going to say, hey, I want to go create, for this cartridge, I want to create custom lifecycle hooks. So I want to give I'm the cartridge developer, I want to give the option to the user when they go create this, that they can go do customized lifecycle and do whatever they want, pre and post build, pre and post deploy, pre and post start, whatever you as the cartridge developer want to allow the user to tweak at different points of the lifecycle. This is where you go and create those scripts. Ditto for markers. Remember, got rid of the Java 6, Java 7 marker to make it run in Java 7, or got rid of Java 7 to let it run in Java 6. Hot deploy is another perfect example. That I want to say, hey, JBoss supports hot deploy, so every time somebody does a git push, I don't want to stop it. I just want to do a build and deploy, because start and stop takes time. Why would I bring the whole app server down? I just want to do a build deploy. JBoss will notice that there's a new deployment in there, and it'll do the redeploy. So these are kind of all the things that you as a cartridge developer can provide to the user to go and modify, simply modify the behavior of the actual cartridge or the application. Questions there? Lots and lots of environmental variables. This one is also kind of in flux. This is pretty close. This is a subset of all the ones that are out there. There's different categories of environmental variables. These are the ones that are system provided. So the node is going to create all these for you, and these you can go reference. You're going to get all cool sorts of stuff like what's the DNS of my particular application. This is going to be bill/origin.rhcloud.com, whatever your particular application is. The app name is going to be what I was in this morning, 41JE. The app UUID is going to be that gigantic UUID. Datadir is going to tell you, give you a path to your persistent data directory for your application. Gear DNS, similarly the DNS for that particular gear. The gear's UUID, which may or may not be the same as the app UUID, whether it's a scaled app or not. HomeDir is essentially the home directory of your gear's user. So all this stuff gets created for you by the node and is available to you, and you can go and reference all this stuff without doing any work. So you know kind of where you are and how everything is binding. There's other ones that are cartridge provided. So for like MySQL, it's saying, hey, here's the username, password, the host name, and the port that MySQL is. And these are the same kind of things when we're talking about hooks are going to be used to go and broadcast over to the other cartridge instances that are going to be listening for that kind of particular information. So lots of environmental variables.
I have a question.
Yep.
When you say data directory, right? Is it the data directory in the primary gear, or do I have a way to access data directory on my non-primary gear?
That's it, the data is, until we have a shared data strategy, the data directory is local to every gear. Every gear has its own data directory.
So if I'm deploying Drupal where I need a persistent file system.
The data directory inside of there's two different environmental variables you can get. There's a temp dir and a data dir. Data dir is persistent. So you can do a snapshot of it, and what you've got in the data dir is going to be captured in the snapshot. You can do a restore. Adam could probably talk about what we do with backups. What's in the temp directory, you have no guarantee at all whether it's not going to be captured inside of a snapshot. Who knows what's in there? We don't worry about that. But it's still all local to the gear. You've got two gears in a scaled application. They each have their data directory. They are not shared. They're not in sync. They're not shared at all.
Yeah, you have to watch out for that. If the gear scales up, you put something there, it scales back down.
It's gone.
That's gone. So it's only for that gear.
Yeah.
That's going to make things interesting in Drupal then.
It makes it interesting for lots of things. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a lot of applications that do replication through a shared, that need replication through, yeah.
If I remember correctly, the Drupal Kickstart is not scalable. So if you like try to go through the web UI, I think the web UI actually tells you it doesn't.
It's not. It's definitely not.
Yeah.
Yeah. However, if you were to like git clone upstream Drupal and make that your code base and deploy, because it's in your Git, that would be replicated out. It's not a part of your persistent data there. It's a problem that needs fixing.
Yeah.
Could you then just rsync between your gears?
Yeah.
You could. I mean, actually, you really could if you wanted to. You could. We even have a cron model. You could cron it minutely if you wanted. I imagine that would get ugly fast, but
Yeah, I mean, if you look, we use rsync all over the place. Like we've got Jenkins to do continuous integration builds, right? So if I'm building my war in Jenkins or in a builder gear, how do I get that war over to where it's actually running, right? We're rsyncing. So if you go look at all the configuration. And the cool thing is a lot of those hooks actually will let you kind of do that. You're going to say, hey, pre-deploy, before I actually go deploy anything, let me actually go get the one that make sure that my data directory is actually in sync. The problem is if your data directory's got lots of data in it.
Okay.
But it's possible if you run it, obviously. Really easy, and this is what I'm just going to go through in the demo, just kind of a quick demo. When you want to install one of these cartridges, so say you've written your cartridge, right? You've created your manifest, you've created your setup and your control scripts. You've gone and done whatever you've got to do to create your stack. Typically, we installing everything from RPMs. We use everything up and online is installed. For RPMs, everything inside of enterprises. Origin, because you've got kind of a lot more control of Origin, it may or may not be RPMs, so you don't necessarily have to do this with Origin. I built the RPM last. I'm not an RPM guy. I will tell you, like Pastor, I'm like every day, I'm like, I don't know what, I broke my spec file. So you can actually, and I'll show you how you can actually just go and test, deploy and test a cartridge without having to go through the RPM process if you don't want to. But it certainly makes life easier once you're at that point. There's just a whole series of scripts that we provide. They all start with OO something. These are all the kind of sysadmin scripts. I want to create an account. I want to start and stop gears. All sorts of kind of cool things that you can do through from kind of an admin. So there's one that's OO admin that'll actually go and install the particular cartridge, which will tell the node and tell the broker that, hey, I've got a new cartridge that's available. And then you go and clear the cache to make sure that what's cached on that node gets cleared so it picks up the new cartridge. And then you can just go and confirm it by doing just an RHC cartridge list to make sure that your cartridge is actually there. Quickstarts, and I'll show this kind of quickly in the demo too. Lots and lots of quick starts up there, as I mentioned. just a couple of examples of them that are up there. So there's, if you see something that isn't, if that stack or if even something sitting on top of one of the cartridge stacks if you're looking for something that's not a cartridge out of the box right now, the next place to go look is just go look at github.com/OpenShift, and there's lots, and it's growing all the time. Cartridges, samples, examples of all sorts of different kind of technologies that are up there. So you may be able to go grab what you need that's already there. And they follow a very kind of typical install pattern. You go and create the base app. You do a pull from that Git repo. You do a push, and you've got your application.
So I should mention here, the RHC tools have a new option where you can just directly pass in the URL of the GitHub repo, and you don't have to do that anymore.
This is the way, yeah, if you go look at a lot of the Quickstarts look like that. Yeah. So totally, if you guys want to go start, say, hey, I maybe don't necessarily want to go create a whole cartridge. I just want to go and create a Git repository that has the cool stuff that I want to go and add. Knock yourself out. We'd love to see that. There's lots of contributions all the time inside of Red Hat and outside of Red Hat. People contributing stuff all the time.
Now, if we want to build a cartridge, we fork one of yours, or we start our own repo, or
We've got a place for community cartridges if you want to put it there, and which is where just kind of the public place is that people would go look for community cartridges. Well, we've also got people who've just inside of their Git repositories creating cartridges. We would love to have you contribute to stuff you're doing back to the community space under OpenShift, but it really doesn't matter. The best probably way to do it is to go fork the community cartridges repo and do it there.
Fork the whole repo?
Just the community cartridges repo.
Yeah, but fork the whole community cartridges repo.
And then push it back into this. It doesn't have that many now. It's not a problem now. We do need to solve that. Yeah, because it's one repo with lots of cartridges. You could go create a repo with just your cartridge too, and we could go get that up ultimately.
I don't know. I don't quite know what I'm going to do yet. But R, obviously.
Yeah, there's lots and lots of.
There isn't an R already.
Yeah. Okay, and that's all I got. So I want to do just kind of a quick little demo of. Well, first so on Friday, I have to be completely blunt here. So people have been asking all the time for a Tomcat cartridge, right? It's the #1 by far Java application server out there. And JBoss has a productized version of Tomcat called the Enterprise Web Server, right? And we offer that. It's available up and online. So if you want to go spin up Tomcat, you can. There's one for Tomcat 6, there's one for Tomcat 7. If you have Enterprise, you get EWS, you get Tomcat 6, you get Tomcat 7. It's the fully supported version that Red Hat JBoss support. On the community side, there's no Tomcat cartridge because EWS is a product, not a project under Red Hat. It's not available in Origin, so there's no Tomcat in Origin right now. Now you could go deploy it from source. You could go up to the EWS cartridge deal and stick it into your application. It's just kind of a pain in the neck, right? So I've been hoping that somebody would come and just create a Tomcat 6 or 7 cartridge and contribute it back to the community, right? So, all right, no, I haven't got any binders on to do that yet. So I said, well, what if I make it really, really easy for somebody to do it? I'm going to go create a Tomcat 8 cartridge. Tomcat 8 is sort of it's in beta right now, so it's not fully released yet by Apache. So I went and created a Tomcat 8 cartridge. So this is the way sort of upstream of Tomcat, hoping that somebody, maybe one of you guys, will go and actually take this as a starting point and go and create a Tomcat 7. So I just want to point out, it literally just took me an hour. I created a cartridge I took the EWS card and modified it to deal with Tomcat 8. There's different configuration scripts. In an hour, I had this thing up and running. It really doesn't take, if there's an existing cartridge that is sort of the same pattern and template that you've got, it does not take very long to go and create a cartridge right now. But I just want to point out a couple of these. So if I go take a look at setup, that's it. Right? That's the whole script. That's the whole setup script. It's creating some links, dealing with supporting. This is a cartridge that, in theory, would support multiple versions. So I'm saying, hey, I'm going to default to version 8. So I want to go copy the stuff out of the versions directory. I want to go and actually create the war file from my template, kind of specific stuff, but that's it, not an awful lot. And the control script isn't much bigger, right? So if I go down and
Basically a PaaS switch.
yeah, so, I'm glad you brought that up. We're doing everything in Bash. It's easy and
Everybody knows it.
everybody knows it's easy. It doesn't have to be, all those scripts just have to be executable. As long as they're executable, you can write anything you want.
I mean, you could put a shebang at the front for Perl or for Python.
As long as it's executable,
Use
setup,
it in
control, all those, as long as they're executable, you can write whatever language you want. So if you go down, there's a couple little helper functions, but so here's start, there's actually just a mapping down at the bottom to go from start to start app. But, I mean, this is really kind of how simple it is, right? So I'm starting up Tomcat, I'm going to go and create a couple of Tomcats and Catalina environmental variables that I need to get set up. I'm going to go and do a little replace of some environmental variables inside of server.xml so that it's binding to the right place and not running into the problem of localhost. And I'm going to call the Tomcat startup script. That's it, right? My cartridge just started. And it's really kind of that simple. The build, if you go down, build is the only other one. In this case, build was actually split out. And this is when it's Java, so it's actually going to go do a Maven build. So this is where I'm setting up some stuff about dealing with how big should my Maven heap space be, and what kind of commands do I actually want to, what are the targets for Maven. In this case, it defaults to clean package with a couple of properties. But it's really kind of that simple. So to go to create a cartridge is really pretty easy right now. So, yeah.
And as far as what counts as executable, it's whatever standard install and rel, is that in terms of
yes.
Ruby, Python,
right. Yep.
Bash?
Yep. Or Fedora. Or,
yeah, like in origin land, it's whatever you want. And,
yeah.
and the other thing is too is once or if you elect to make it an RPM, you can just add whatever your language runtime as a dependency to the package, right? So if that cartridge is installed on a node, then you can ensure that the runtime to control it is installed as well.
Now, suppose you're building from upstream source, and the upstream source changes versions. How do you get the new source into the cartridge?
Everything we're doing.
I think that actually depends on the cartridge creator. They
Right.
would have to make their cartridge backward compatible or have some logic in there to upgrade.
And that's also the beauty of it. If it's an RPM, if it is a repo, that you can get that updated one into.
Well, yeah, there's an RPM.
Yeah.
One of the packages I wanted, does not, it has an RPM, but not, it messes with the Qt libraries.
We enforce packaging internally for online,
Well,
for
yeah.
enterprise, right? But for what Origin does, that's really up to the. But if you're a cartridge developer, you want your cartridge to be adopted.
Yeah, you have
If you create an RPM, you're probably going to have a much wider community that's going to go, wow, I can really just install this and go try it out versus.
Is there any sort of best practices document?
For RPM build?
For cartridges?
Well, there's
that
also
says
Fedora packaging
build it.
guidelines.
So there's a walkthrough of everything needed to build a V2 cartridge, and it walks you through the various pieces. Basically, Bill's presentation with more detail.
Right, with a lot of more optional stuff. But the packaging, that's the cartridge itself. They're on as packaging, we really kind of leave up to however you want to package it. And the nice thing is what's coming is you don't necessarily have to package it all. One of the things we're adding to online, and obviously will come from Origin as upstream, is you can go through RHC or through the GUI and just point it to a GitHub repo. This is coming, hopefully by Summit. I can't commit to that, but hopefully. That you can just create your cartridge, put it in your Git repo, and it's a properly formed cartridge, like a couple of things I just went through. You go up and say, instantiate me this cartridge, and we haven't installed it at all. It's not on a node. Adam hasn't gone and installed it and done install. And we'll pull down the cartridge and instantiate it. And so it doesn't live anywhere on our boxes. You're just instantiating it. So you don't have to package it at all in that case. it just sits in Git.
Yeah, so
That'll be a huge one for us.
That would work really well for what I'm doing, because everything I've got, almost everything I need is on GitHub, except R, and R is packaged, so.
Yeah, and then you don't have to worry about packaging. You just point origin at your GitHub repo and we'll instantiate it. And there's some stuff we got to do behind the scenes to make that really kind of consumable. We need to do some caching because now, say you want to go create a JBoss 8, but we haven't actually installed JBoss 8. Now you need to include JBoss 8 in your cartridge, because cartridge now can sort of say, hey, I require all these other libraries, but the cartridge doesn't have to include them. But now if I'm downloading everything, all your dependencies have to come with you. So that Git clone could be expensive. So we're going to add a lot of kind of caching and stuff behind there. That's like sort of the first time it's going to hurt, because I do have to download that. But then the next guy who comes around can take advantage of the fact that you've already done it, because we can cache that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was just going to comment real quick. In terms of RPM packaging V2 cartridges, we are still working on best practices for that. And once we get to a point where it's functional, we are going to actually send out a draft proposal of what we think the idea should be to the community dev lists and get feedback and see what people think of it and kind of hash it out. So V2 cartridge packaging into RPMs is still in a state of flux.
So that brings up, just really quick, how many of you have not signed up for the Google Plus community? Because if you haven't, you can leave today. You can't eat any of the pizza that's out there. You cannot have beer in the back room if you are not in the Google community. And I'm serious about this. Check your ID.
So let's say, and I know there's been some discussion about whether or not it's the right way to do it or not, but let's say you turn WordPress into a cartridge, right? So there's a dependency on that one. Let's just say by default you set MySQL and PHP for that. Is the only way you set the dependencies between cartridges to basically say you need these RPMs there? Or is there a way in the spec to say that this spec must also pull in these child dependencies?
Dependencies between cartridges or dependencies between a cartridge and a library?
Well, in this case of OpenShift, it would be cartridges, right? So you need the PHP 5.4 cartridge that OpenShift has, because you need to make sure those variables are the way. The MySQL one you need as well. Or, I mean,
so things like WordPress we don't put into cartridges.
well, I understand. So I'm just saying a case for, if there's, that's like what I'm trying to do to illustrate if there was anything like that's an interdependency for cartridges. And so that's an example.
That you still have to work out.
WordPress is already, there's an instant app up there that deploys it. Yeah.
So, maybe I think
about
what I'm trying to say,
right, yeah.
I'm trying to illustrate the interdependency.
Yeah, we still have to work out that dependency. Right now, the dependencies within cartridges assume that the other cartridge is available but not configured on your app. But once you switch to pulling stuff from GitHub and stuff, we still need to work out what that would involve.
Yeah, so like right now the only kind of dependency checking we have in place is if you try to create an app with just a database, it's going to tell you that you need an actual web cartridge to attach it to or something.
Because it's more as this, I mean, it's more and more community cartridges get pushed, you're going to have that line where faster and faster.
Yeah.
Because the guy, Tony, right, from New Relic, was talking about, because New Relic wants to try and inject a monitoring agent.
We want a New Relic the world.
It's the whole world. I know the agents, I know this, I've played with it. But into existing cartridges rather than buy, like, not build, rather, not buy, but build a whole slew of new ones. In those action hooks you had earlier, is that a possibility? Is that where you would put that?
You could do almost anything with an action hook.
With New Relic, I would think you would have a New Relic cartridge that would run on all hooks. On all gears, and you can just have one of them elect to be the listener, while the rest of them elect to be the agents or something.
Do you have to have one for each language agent?
Right.
It wouldn't matter because you'd say create me an app with PHP and New Relic. Yeah. And New Relic would be on all gears.
So currently, when you're creating a new app or a new gear, you list all its dependencies in that one command, and you say, I also need MySQL. Is one way of doing it. You can also add MySQL for a database after the fact. but you could do it all in one command right now. Say, give me an app plus these, here are the dependencies.
Okay.
I just want to emphasize, I'm not sure which one of you guys have said it, but one of the things in the manifest is, and this is sort of our first step, that one of the things that's in the manifest that I haven't touched on, it's not in this one, but this is the actual manifest for the Tomcat 8 cartridge, but you can go and say, this provides these things, these kind of keys. You can also say requires. This is where it can say, hey, this requires Postgres. Maybe it requires Postgres 8.4, and when somebody goes and tries to create this, that's where it's going to be. So we're headed kind of down that road that you can go and say, inside of the manifest, this cartridge needs these other kinds of dependencies on these other cartridges. And then in the library case, it's, you know, if we're going to go down the RPM road, there's RPMs.
That provides and requires there, is that all namespace based on what cartridges are validated by the community, or?
No, nothing really.
That's what needs to be
worked out.
standard.
Okay, yeah.
Right now, the provides and requires refer to only cartridges distributed with OpenShift, not community.
Yeah.
Built-in ones.
And there's been a lot of, especially lately, conversations about, do we include a vendor name, or do we want to call this Red Hat something, right?
Yeah,
the one
yeah.
provided by us. I don't know. And do we want to have a best practice for, if you're a community card, do you want to preface it with your, I don't know, community or your name? We're trying to come up with sort of a way to
name spacing issues and who owns the authority to give, delegate.
Name spacing and versioning are two things that are being sorted.
Cool.
So the last, I'm probably running.
We had a question.
Oh, was there another
John,
question?
yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I have a question. This is a little generic, not with Cartridge itself, but more with the OpenShift platform.
Yeah.
So I think most of the platform is built in Ruby.
Yes.
So how do you feel about Ruby as a language of choice for the platform itself?
I'm sitting down before I answer this question. I'm a Java guy, man. I'm a Python guy.
He's Java, he's Python, I like Ruby. When we started the team, we had to choose, and there was like an internal vote, and Ruby won.
There's also a certain amount that's written in Bash, honestly, right?
Yeah. OpenShift is Ruby and Bash. Yeah.
And I assume some of that would be historical as well, right? Which came through an acquisition, so.
Actually, the acquisition is Java.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Makar's product was written in Java.
It was, we internally, like within the team at that point in time, Ruby won.
A lot of the bits that you might need to customize or configure are kind of in config files off to the side, so is that mostly true, or?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, so there isn't you don't need to be a Ruby expert, don't let that rule out this,
The cartridges are completely language agnostic. You can write those scripts in whichever language you like. You just put a different
Maybe Bash, Python, Lua, if you feel adventurous.
You need something executable and you need to gamble. And then you need to be able to write a template in whatever you're an expert in, because you're writing that cartridge.
I heard at some point there was a lot. I mean, because like the Alios project is in Ruby, and I think Catello, parts of Catello are Ruby, and there was like this whole cloud thing happening in Ruby. And I believe, as I understand it, that's kind of how that decision was made.
It sort of dictated that some of our, not dictated, but decided that a bunch of our apps have been written in Ruby. So it gained a little momentum and spread to like what you're saying, LS, hello.
Yeah.
Ruby, spreading like a virus.
Ruby the language, I think, is interesting. The gem community is a bit of a wild west that you have to kind of deal with.
Have you seen Node?
Wild West. I got friends that are trying to convince me that Go is the next thing. So.
Well, I think Node's core language is still a wild west. They're
We're getting all recording here.
Do what?
We're recording all of this.
Hey, no, I think that's valid.
No, I've written this on my blog. I don't care.
Yeah.
The thing is, though, it's still a young project. Like they're still sorting stuff out. I'm not saying it's bad. They're just figuring it out.
It's just young.
I just want to let me make one last. This is the cool thing that I keep raving about that Krishna created. This is VirtualBox It all gets installed through Vagrant. It runs all the Puppet scripts. So this is a full-blown running on my Mac. There's a full-blown OpenShift from whatever the nightly build was when I built this Friday or something. So it's got all the latest and greatest. When you go and see the cartridges up there, everything from OpenShift gets installed in user lab exec OpenShift for the most part. All the cartridges are living in that cartridges directory. Those are all the V1 cartridges. In the V2 directory, there's nothing in there because there's nothing been installed for V2. So when you go and create a cartridge, there's a little install script that you can go and use. Go install the RPM. What the RPM will actually do is drop it into V2. And then you can just go and do what I said, install and flush the cache, which will go and take your cartridge and stick it into the actual V2 cache. Or, if you don't want to go down the RPM road, this is what I do all the time when I'm creating these cartridges, is actually just put your cartridge in that V2 directory. You don't have to create an RPM, just put it in there. Install it, do the little script, clear the cache, and you've got a cartridge. And then once your cartridge is actually working, then you can go down the RPM road, if you want to, right? And that's it. So that's where the cartridges are.
And the PHP V2 cartridge will run on Fedora 18 now. And the Puppet script has a hidden option because I haven't documented it. If you switch that to true, it will be V2.
So say that again louder. Say that
So
again.
what is the configuration option?
The option itself, I'll pull it up.
There's also varlib OpenShift .cartridge repo, which is where they end up when you install them.
Yeah, it's actually in .cartridge. That's when you actually do that and run that install script. V1 didn't work this way. We were actually running from that directory in V1 straight. And it becomes sort of more of that directory becomes more of kind of a sandbox. And then when you actually run that install script for V2, it puts it into a cache directory. And that's where we run from now, which is why you have to go through that install. But it's really simple. So
the Puppet option is use _v2 _carts. So if you set that to true, then you're running the Puppet script, it will install it.
Yeah, and there's also a little toggle script that you can just toggle back and forth between. There's like a whole card version, I think. You just do a toggle and it'll switch you back and forth between.
All right. So now you're all well versed in cartridges and how to build one. So now it's time to grab a beer in the back of the room. I can smell the pizza in the hallway. So have a beer. And now I have USB keys with Origin on them. So if you don't have Origin running on your desktop, you'd like to try and get that done, we've got people in the room who can help you make that happen. And Bill, I wanted to introduce you to this gentleman here who's trying to write a React cartridge.
Sure.
So Adrian here, and Adrian, you should put a pitch in for Node PDX. How many of you in here are from Portland, actually? Good, you should all go to the Node PDX event coming up.
I'm already signed up.
Yeah.
It was damn good luck.
Thank you.
Also, if you guys are interested, we'll have more of these shirts at the OpenStack Summit. But if you're interested in a OpenShift t-shirt, I got a couple of them up here.